The mud from my wife's grave was still wet on my shoes when my key stopped working in my own front door. I tried it twice, not because I thought the key would change its mind, but because grief makes you doubt the simplest things. That blue door had been there for 39 years. Linda chose the colour herself and told me a house should look like it's happy to see you. That afternoon, it did not let me in. If you have ever watched someone you love decide you had become inconvenient, stay with me because this story is for you. And if it moves you, take a second to subscribe because families protect their own here and I want you in the room for what my son forgot. Through the front window, I could see two men I had never met carrying our wedding photographs toward a moving truck. My son Aaron stood behind them in the same black trousers he'd worn at his mother's funeral 3 hours earlier. He had already taken off his tie and rolled his sleeves the way a man does when he's in the middle of a job he once finished. I knocked on the glass of my own house. Aaron opened the door only far enough to fill the gap with his body. A suitcase sat at his feet. It was mine. "Dad," he said. I was going to explain. Behind him, someone was unbolting the bookshelf I built the winter Aaron was born. I could hear the wood complain as they forced the screws. "You changed the locks," I said. "Mum wanted me to have the house." He handed me a photocopied page with Linda's signature at the bottom, a document he called a codicil. According to the dates printed above her name, she had signed it 4 days before she died. I am a slow man by trade. I spent 40 years restoring old houses, and old houses teach you not to trust the first thing you see. A crack in the plaster is never just a crack. A door that won't close is telling you something about the frame. So I did not shout. I read the page. Then I looked at my son. "Your mother couldn't move her right hand that week," I said. "The tumour was pressing on the nerve. She couldn't hold a fork, let alone a pen." For the first time, his eyes left mine. Aaron had changed the locks. What he hadn't changed was the date. And the date was the first thing that told me my son hadn't simply taken my house. He had forged his dead mother's hand to do it. I want to tell you the rest slowly because I nearly missed all of it, and the parts I nearly missed are the parts that mattered. Aaron started talking the way he talks when he's already decided how a conversation is going to end. The house was too big for one man, he said. I shouldn't be rattling around in it alone at 68. He'd already found me a unit in a retirement community out on Route 9, a nice one with people my own age. The market was strong. It made sense to sell now while the numbers were good. Mum would have wanted the family settled. Settled for who? I asked. He lost a little of his patience then. He told me how much he'd carried during Linda's illness, how much he'd given up. That was a lie with a true thread running through it. Aaron had visited. He had driven her to 2 appointments and paid for 1 round of medication before the insurance kicked in. But I was the one who sat with her every night for 22 months. I was the one who learned to change a dressing without waking her. He moved to the part he'd clearly rehearsed. I'd always put Linda first, he said. His parents sat on a paid-off house while their son struggled. What's the point of family money? He said, if it can't save family. I looked at the man in front of me and remembered a boy who once asked me to teach him how to build a birdhouse, who cried when the first one came apart in the rain, and then built a second one that's still nailed to the oak in the backyard. That boy was now standing in the doorway he had locked against me, explaining why I no longer belonged behind it. He nudged the suitcase toward me with his foot. Inside I could see he'd packed a few shirts, my blood pressure pills, a toothbrush, my razor. He had decided in an afternoon what a man needs to carry out of 39 years. I did not reach for it. Where is your mother's cedar box? I asked. Aaron stopped, just for a second, but I'd spent my life watching for the moment a board flexes before it breaks, and I saw it. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, but he did. He'd been looking for something in that house all day and hadn't found it. I could have forced my way in. I could have called the police right there on the porch and let the evening turn into flashing lights and neighbours at their windows. But I've learned that a frightened man in a doorway is looking for a story, and I did not want to hand him one. I did not want Aaron telling anyone that his grieving father had lost control, that maybe the old man wasn't fit to make his own decisions anymore, that maybe he needed someone appointed to look after his affairs. So I took out my phone and photographed the codicil in his hand. Then I gave it back. "Keep the suitcase," I said. "I'll come back for what belongs to me." "The house doesn't belong to you anymore, Dad." I didn't argue. I walked back to my truck. I walked away from this house I had spent 39 years building, not because my son was right, but because I needed him to believe I had nowhere else to go. I drove to Ben Ortiz's place 3 doors down. Ben and I have known each other since Reagan. He took one look at my shoes and my face and put the kettle on without asking anything. That's the kind of friend to have when the world tips over. While I waited for a woman named Margaret Sloan to call me back, I sat in Ben's kitchen and let myself remember the house because I was afraid that if I stopped remembering it, I'd start believing it had never really been mine. Linda and I bought it the year we married. It was a wreck then, a foreclosure with a caved-in porch and a kitchen that smelled like a wet dog. Everyone told us to walk away. Linda stood in the middle of that ruined kitchen, looked at the one big window facing the street, and said she wanted to be able to see our children come home from school. We didn't have children yet. We didn't have money. We had a window and a plan. I rebuilt that house one room at a time, every time we scraped together enough. Linda painted behind me. We lived in sawdust for years. The 3rd stair still has a gouge in it from the toy fire truck Aaron drove down the steps when he was 4. There's a door frame in the hall where Linda marked his height every birthday in pencil, a ladder of little lines climbing toward the ceiling. I built the back porch the summer he turned 6 so he'd have somewhere to sleep on hot nights. The house wasn't a property. It was the 2 of us in wood and paint and pencil. Somewhere along the way, Aaron stopped hearing it that way. When he was young, he called it home. In his 20s, he started calling it the house. By his 30s, in that easy way he had of turning everything into a deal, it had become the property. And his mother's garden had become a lot you could probably subdivide. I told myself that was just how men talk when they work in real estate. I told myself a lot of things. I remembered one afternoon in particular, the way you remember a single day out of 10,000 for no reason you can name. Sophie must have been 6. Linda was on her knees in the flower bed by the kitchen window showing her how to press a bulb into the soil pointed side up, and Aaron was standing on the new back porch, with his phone against his ear, pacing, talking to someone about square footage and comps, and what the lot would list for, if it ever came to that. Linda looked up at him through the window, and she looked at me, and she didn't say a word. But I saw something cross her face that I mistook at the time for tiredness. I understand now it was grief. She was already mourning something in our son that I was still refusing to see. She went back to the flowers and told Sophie that the trick with bulbs is patience, that you plant them in the cold and the dark and you just have to trust they know what they're doing under there. Sophie asked what happens if they don't come up. "Then you planted them wrong," Linda said. "Or somebody dug them up too early." She was looking at the window when she said it. Ben touched my shoulder. He'd remembered something. He has a camera over his garage aimed down the shared driveway, and it catches a slice of my front yard. We pulled the footage up on his laptop. There it was, laid out in timestamps. Aaron's car had arrived at the house at 1:40 in the afternoon. The funeral hadn't even ended. A locksmith's van pulled in at 2:15, the moving truck at 3 o'clock, and at 3:40 a man in a grey suit walked up to Aaron and handed him a folder. I recognized him. He'd come to the house once months earlier, a private lender Aaron introduced as a business associate. I remembered thinking at the time that my son's associates didn't usually wear suits like that on a Sunday. My son had not changed the locks because grief made him reckless. He had scheduled the locksmith before his mother was in the ground. Margaret called at 6:30. She'd been Linda's friend for 30 years and her lawyer for 20. She is not the kind of lawyer who fixes everything with one phone call, and I want you to understand that because the truth is slower and better than the movies. I told her what had happened. She asked 3 questions. Had Aaron given me any paperwork? Did I have a copy? Was someone in the house right now? I told her about the codicil and sent her the photo. She went quiet for a long time. "Thomas," she finally said. Linda expected pressure. I don't think she expected this. Then she told me what Linda had done 6 months before she died, in the weeks when she was still strong enough to sit in Margaret's office and think clearly. She and I had together placed the house into something called the Hale Family Residence Trust. I'd signed the papers myself. I'll be honest with you, I'd half forgotten. To me, it had been an afternoon of initialing pages I didn't fully follow, because Linda had read them and Linda understood these things, and I trusted her the way you trust the one person who has never once steered you wrong. That trust changed everything. The house was not Linda's to give away, not to Aaron, not to anyone. I was the surviving trustee. I had the right to live there for the rest of my life. Even if the signature on Aaron's codicil had been real, the document couldn't reach into the trust and pull the house out. It was legally a piece of paper about nothing. Then why? I asked Margaret, didn't Linda just tell me she was worried about him? Because she didn't want to spend her last months watching you go to war with your own son, she said. She wanted you to grieve her, not fight over her. And there was one more thing. Linda had left a letter. It was written to Aaron and it was sealed, and Margaret had strict instructions. The letter was only to be given to him if he ever tried to sell the house, transfer it, or force me out of it. He had done all three before dinner. Margaret checked the county records while we were on the phone and found a preliminary sale agreement with a closing scheduled in 3 days. Aaron had already taken an advance against it. Money paid to him on the strength of a sale he had no right to make. If we didn't move quickly, other people's money would get tangled in it, and untangling it would take years. Linda had written the letter. Aaron had triggered it. But before I let him hear his mother's final words, I needed to know exactly what he had already done in her name. I lay awake that night in Ben's spare room and I made myself look at the thing I'd been avoiding for a decade. Aaron hadn't fallen into this in a single afternoon of grief. He'd been walking toward it for years, and I'd held the door. He'd had real success once when he was young. He bought a rundown place, fixed it, sold it for a profit. I lent him the down payment. I did the framing myself for free. I found him a good electrician and co-signed his first real loan. And Aaron came to believe he had a gift, that the market was a thing. He understood the way I understood a mortise and tenon. Then he reached too far. He bought into a cluster of distressed houses meant to be flipped in 6 months. Material prices climbed. Permits stalled. A partner walked. And instead of stopping, instead of taking the loss like a grown man, Aaron kept borrowing to keep the corpse breathing. He used the family savings. He used credit cards. I later learned he'd used the account he'd set up for my granddaughter Sophie's education. And when all of that ran dry, he went to a private lender at a rate that would frighten a loan shark. By the time Linda got sick, Aaron owed $185,000 and one of those notes was coming due. And in the worst months of his mother's illness, he had started asking her questions. Where were the papers? Was the house in a trust? If Dad ever needed care, who could sell it? Linda answered none of them the way he wanted. Once near the end, she told me he'd come to her bedside with a document and a pen, while I was out picking up her prescription, and asked her to sign. She had asked him a simple question first. If your father can live there as long as he wants, she'd said, then why does your name need to be on it? Aaron hadn't answered. He'd folded the paper and put it away and kissed her forehead and told her to rest. And Linda had called Margaret the next morning. She'd tried to warn me in her way. Years back, she'd told me, every time you rescue him, Thomas, he learns that panic is a plan. I'd waved it off. I thought Aaron just needed one more push, one more good year. I'd spent his whole life fixing his mistakes the way I'd fix a door that had dropped on its hinges, planing the edge, shimming the frame, doing whatever it took to make it close again. What I never made him do was straighten the frame that had warped in the first place. Linda understood before I did. My son wasn't one opportunity away from becoming responsible. He was one rescue away from believing responsibility no longer applied to him. Margaret told me I had options. She could go to a judge, get an emergency order, bring a sheriff's deputy to the door. It would be fast and it would be ugly, and it would leave 100 questions unanswered. Because I didn't only want my house back. I wanted to know what Aaron had told his wife Claire. I wanted to know who had helped him draw up a forged codicil. I wanted to know who else he'd promised the house to, and I wanted to find Linda's cedar box before he did. So I called my son, and I made my voice sound like a man who has run out of fight. I told him I didn't want a war 3 days after burying his mother. I asked if we could just sit down at the two of us and finish this cleanly. I heard the relief come into his voice. He'd been braced for a battle, and here was his tired old father folding. And then because he thought he'd won, Aaron talked too much. He offered me a deal. I'd sign a paper agreeing to leave the house voluntarily. In exchange, he'd cover 6 months of rent at the retirement community. I wouldn't contest the sale. And he'd keep some of Mum's things safe for me. The cedar box, I said. Where is it? Claire probably packed it, he said. But an hour later, Claire texted me privately. She'd never seen the box. She also asked me something that made my chest go tight. Didn't you agree to move out after the funeral? She wrote. Aaron said you two talked about it months ago. No. I wrote back, that was all. I didn't explain. Let the single word do its work. I told Claire not to do anything yet and to take Sophie to her mother's for a day or two. Then I agreed to Aaron's meeting. He wanted it at the house the morning before the closing, so I could sign in front of the buyer's representative and make it all official. He thought the meeting was where I'd surrender. I knew it was where he'd have to choose in front of his own wife before he ever heard his mother's voice. I did not need Aaron frightened. Frightened men deny everything and hire their own lawyers. I needed him certain that the last signature, standing between him and the money, was mine. I went back to the house on the morning of the meeting. Aaron had staged it like a place a man leaves willingly. My belongings were boxed and stacked in the garage. The family photographs were down off the walls. The living room had been emptied out for listing photos, and there was a "coming soon" sign leaning against the workbench. Then I saw the doorframe in the hall. The pencil ladder Aaron's heights every birthday of his childhood had been painted over, a fresh coat of flat white to make the house show newer. My son had erased the record of his own growing up to move the property faster. I didn't shout. I put 2 fingers against the paint. It was dry. Claire arrived with Sophie, and I asked her to walk Sophie down to Ben's. When she came back, she stood in the middle of the emptied living room and asked Aaron straight out whether it was true that I had never agreed to leave. Aaron's story bent under her. First I'd implied it. Then Mum had talked about it. Then I was confused. Grief did that to older people. Claire asked to see the paper Linda had signed. Aaron said she'd only ever seen a scan. Margaret, who had come with me, asked to see the original. Aaron said the original was at the closing office. There was no original. I was almost sure of it now. But I needed to be certain of one thing first. Years ago, when I built the workbench in the back room, I'd made a shallow hollow in the floor beneath it, a place to keep the things you don't want a burglar to find. Aaron never knew it was there. He'd never really known how the house was built, only what it might sell for. I crouched down, worked the board loose, and there it was. Linda's cedar box, the one I made her our first year married, sitting in the dark, exactly where she must have hidden it herself in her last strong weeks. Aaron had torn the house apart looking for it and never found it because he had never once understood the thing he was trying to sell. I did not open it there. I carried it out to the living room and set it on the one table left standing. Aaron had spent a week searching for a piece of paper that could stop him. What he never grasped was that the paper that could stop him had been safe in Margaret's office downtown the whole time. The only thing hidden in the house was the reason his mother had needed to protect it. The buyer's representative arrived, a polite young woman with a folder, and started to explain what she needed from me. My signature confirming I gave up my right to live there. My signature confirming I wouldn't contest the sale. My signature confirming I was leaving of my own free will. Aaron played the gracious son in front of her. This was what his mother wanted, he said. He was only trying to take care of me. "How much of the sale have you already spent?" I asked him. He said he didn't know what I meant. Margaret laid it out on the table without theatrics. The trust document. The county record showing the house had been held in trust for 6 months. The photo of the codicil, Aaron's loan file, Ben's time-stamped camera footage. She explained it plainly and briefly the way she does. The house was in the Hale Family Residence Trust. I was the surviving trustee. Aaron had no authority to sell it. The codicil could not move property out of the trust, even if it were genuine, and the signature showed clear signs of forgery. Changing the locks and removing my belongings could carry both civil and criminal consequences. The buyer's representative closed her folder and stopped taking notes. I watched Claire take a step back from her husband, one small step, like the floor near him had gone soft. Aaron didn't crumble. He came at me. I was destroying the family. I had a house, a pension savings, and my son was drowning. He only needed a piece of what would come to him anyway. His mother would never want her son bankrupt. "Did your mother tell you that?" I asked. She didn't have to. That's when I put my hand on the cedar box, and I gave him the last off-ramp I had in me to give. "Before I open this," I said, "tell the truth. Not to the lawyer, not to the buyer, to your wife." He tried one more time to soften it. But Claire had found her voice, and she asked him the questions I couldn't. Had he used Sophie's education money? Had he promised this house to the lender? Had I ever once agreed to any of it? Aaron admitted it in pieces the way a dam gives, and then he said the thing that told me exactly how he'd made peace with himself. "I wasn't stealing it," he said. "I was taking what would have been mine anyway." "An inheritance is what someone chooses to leave you," I said. "What you take while they're still alive has another name." I opened the box. Inside were photographs of Linda, an old brass door key worn smooth, a note in her hand for me, and a sealed envelope with Aaron's name on it. I did not read his letter alone. I handed it to him and I asked him to read it out loud, and after a moment he did. "Aaron," it began, "if you're hearing this, then you've done the one thing I hoped grief would stop you from doing." She wrote that she knew. She knew the flip had failed. She knew about the debt. She knew he'd come to her bedside with papers when I was out of the house and that he'd believed she was too weak to understand what she was signing. His voice caught on that line and he kept going. "I know exactly when you became frightened," she wrote. "I also know when the fear turned into thinking you were owed something. Then she did the cruelest kind thing a mother can do. She reminded him who he'd been. She wrote about the boy who slept on the floor beside her bed, the winter she had the flu, so he could tell her if she stopped breathing. The boy who saved his allowance to buy her a set of wind chimes. The boy who once asked her why people lock their doors when the whole family is already inside. You weren't born believing love owed you a house," she wrote. "We taught you that slowly every time we took away a consequence before it could reach you." That line was for me as much as for him. I took it standing up. She hadn't cut him off completely. She'd set aside a small amount in the trust meant for debt counselling, and a fresh start and a portion earmarked directly for Sophie's schooling. And she'd left him a choice. He could receive that help and some of the family keepsakes on one condition, that he never tried to take my home or push me out of it. If he did, the help meant for him would pass instead to Sophie's fund. Not to punish him, she wrote, but to protect the next one in line. He had failed the one condition, and he'd never even known there was a reward on the other side of passing it. She ended it the way that undid me. Not with a curse, not with a threat. "If you've already taken your father's keys," she wrote, "give them back before he has to ask. You may still lose the house. Don't lose the man who built it." Aaron set the letter down. He didn't cry, not then. He looked at me and asked in a small voice, "She thought I would do this?" "She hoped you wouldn't," I said. He saw the old brass key in the box. It was the door key from when he was a boy, the one Linda had kept all these years, because she couldn't throw away anything his small hands had held. And I watched my son understand too late that his mother hadn't only built a wall to keep him out of the house. She'd left a path for him to find his way back. It was just that walking back was never going to be as easy as turning a key. Claire was the one who broke the silence in that emptied living room. She turned to Aaron, and her voice was steadier than I expected the voice of a woman who has just watched the floor of her life drop away and has decided to keep standing anyway. "You told me he agreed," she said. "You told me we talked about it as a family. You looked at me across our own kitchen table, and you told me your father wanted this." Aaron said her name like it was a rope he could pull himself up on. She didn't give him the rope. Sophie's college account, she said. Is it gone? He didn't answer which was an answer. She picked up her purse and her keys and she walked out to get our granddaughter from Ben's, and Aaron stood in the middle of the room he'd emptied and watched the last person who'd believed him go through the blue door. I almost felt for him. That's the trap of being a father. Even now, even there, some old reflex in me wanted to fix it, wanted to plane the edge and shim the frame and make the door close. I made myself stand still. Linda's line was in my head. Every time you rescue him, he learns that panic is a plan. The sale collapsed that week. The closing company flagged the file for suspected fraud and walked away. The buyer demanded the return of their deposit. A locksmith came to the house one more time, and this time the lawful owner had called him. My belongings came back out of the garage. Margaret laid the two paths in front of me for the codicil. Aaron had doctored a scan and passed it off as real, but hadn't yet filed it with the court. I could press charges and I'd win. But she could also use the threat of charges as leverage. Get Aaron to sign a full admission return, the advance hand over every document, and agree in writing to stay away from my accounts and my property. That path pointed the ending toward regret instead of a prison cell. I chose it mostly, but it wasn't entirely mine to choose. Aaron had used the forged document to take money from a private lender, and that lender was a victim too, and the law doesn't let a father simply forgive that away. In the end, Aaron took a deal. Probation, restitution, community service, mandatory financial counseling. Not decades in a cell. I didn't want my son destroyed. I wanted him stopped and I wanted him to feel it. And there's a difference. He lost more than the deal. He lost the last of his professional standing. He lost access to family money for good. He lost Claire's trust, and for a while he lost Claire and Sophie, who went to stay with her mother. She didn't file for divorce. She said she needed time to decide who she'd married. That was truer and harder than any courtroom, and I didn't blame her for a minute of it. A few weeks later, Aaron came to the house. He didn't have a key anymore. He didn't pound on the door or make a scene. He set the old brass key from the cedar box on the porch, and beside it, he left the first of his restitution payments, a list of the things he'd sold or lost, the address of the storage unit where the rest of my belongings sat, and a letter he'd written by hand. I opened the door. I didn't invite him in. I kept telling myself I was saving my family, he said. You were saving the version of yourself you wanted them to believe in. I said. He didn't argue. And that more than any payment was the first honest thing I'd seen from him in years. I told him where the lines were. I would not pay his debts. I would not lend him another dollar. I would not withdraw the legal protections. He would not come into the house unless he was invited. Everything meant for Sophie would go straight through the trust where his hands couldn't reach it. But I also told him he could write. He could go to counselling. He could fix one thing at a time. I made him no promise that any of it would put us back the way we were. I want to tell you how it ends, because I know you've been waiting on the mud and the door and the box, and you deserve the whole thing. A few months on, I moved back into the house for good. I hung the wedding photographs again. I sanded the paint off that doorframe in the hall until the pencil marks came back up, out of the wood, faint but there, Aaron's whole childhood climbing toward the ceiling. I put Linda's cedar box on the mantel where I could see it. I changed the locks one last time, my own hands this time, and I left the door itself exactly the colour she'd chosen. Sophie came to visit. She stood on the porch and asked me why I hadn't painted the door a different colour after everything that happened to me on the other side of it. The door didn't do anything wrong, I told her. She thought about that the way 9-year-olds do, seriously, and then she nodded like it was obvious, and maybe it was. We planted flowers together in Linda's bed by the kitchen window, the same kind Linda used to grow, so that next spring I'd be able to see something of her come back up out of the ground. That evening I found the shoes I'd worn to the funeral, the mud on them gone hard and grey. I took them out to the porch and I brushed them clean. I didn't throw them away. Grief is a lot like that mud, I've come to think. Leave it too long and it sets like concrete, but you don't get rid of every trace of it either. You just learn to walk on without carrying it into every room in the house. Aaron believed that changing the locks would make the house his. What he learned too late is that a home doesn't belong to whoever's holding the newest key. It belongs to the people who protected what happened inside it. Linda protected me with a trust. She tried to protect our son with a letter. The first one saved the house. Whether the second one saved Aaron is a question only he can answer, and he'll be answering it for the rest of his life. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with an old man through the longest day of his life. If Linda's letter got to you the way it got to me, leave a comment and tell me about the person in your family who saw the truth before anyone else did. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because there's always someone at the door with a key that shouldn't fit, and there's always someone who left a letter to stop them. Take care of the ones who protected you, and if you still have your mother's handwriting somewhere in a drawer, go find it tonight.